Okay, juniors, we're going to look at this conflict of the industrial age of big business versus labor. And as businesses grow and consolidate, these you might call them titans of industry, or perhaps some of you have come to the belief that they're robber barons. As the titans of industry consolidate and come to control more of their industries, how does labor do the same? Starting with our objective, interpret the impact of the change from workshop to factory on workers' lives. We'll discuss the lives of workers today, including the new industrial age from 1870 to 1800. We're going to look at labor unions like the American Federation of Labor. We'll also discuss the Wobblies, or the industrial workers of the world, and look at several violent strikes. The Pullman strike, which we have already mentioned, but the Haymarket Square riot will be something new. And then you guys have investigated John David Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. We talked about them a little bit, but we will go into greater detail about them today. We'll talk about labor leaders like Samuel Gompers, Eugene Debs, and A. Philip Randolph. And remember, your assessments, your big assessments are going to be based on the objectives and the names, phrases, terms inside these assessments. So pay close attention to those. All right, let's begin. So Andrew Carnegie is one of these rags to riches American stories. He comes into the United States as a Scottish immigrant, and he's born of immigrant parents, of course, and he starts to work at about 12. He's productive. The owner of this railroad company that he's working with sees a lot of potential in him. He allows him to buy shares into the company. The family mortgages their home to be able to buy shares in that rail company, and Andrew Carnegie very quickly becomes extremely wealthy. By 1865, he's not working for this railroad company anymore. It takes him full time. It's a full-time job to manage his money. Carnegie visits Britain and sees the Bessemer process at work, and he wants to invest in that. He comes back to the United States and starts the Carnegie Steel Company. And he's a pioneer in new management techniques. Carnegie is he's like tedious in determining how can he cut excess costs, make the product better, but make the product cheaper. So he's a hands-on manager. He encourages like competition within his executives in order to have the best and the brightest. So he does have a very talented work staff, and he offers them incentives to buy into the company and earn money when the company earns money. So Carnegie uses vertical integration, and let's talk about what vertical integration is here. If you'll look at this chart, you see how that's explained. Vertical integration is when you work to control all of the raw materials in the manufacturing of your goods. So Carnegie's in the steel industry, raw materials in steel, iron, ore. Okay, so he wants, he's working to buy the resources, iron deposits and ore deposits. Okay, so also you have to get that iron and ore transported to the steel mill, to the factory itself. Okay, so he also works to buy out rail lines so that he can transport the good. So that's called vertical integration. All right. Carnegie also employs horizontal integration. That means companies that are manufacturing the same product that you are manufacturing, buying out those companies. So Carnegie uses vertical integration as well as horizontal integration by buying out competing companies. And so by the time we reach the 1890s, Carnegie controls most of the steel in the United States. He's outproducing Britain in the world. About 90% of the steel in the United States is being produced in the 1890s by Carnegie Steel Company. Okay. So one of the ideological principles that will drive the industrial age is called social Darwinism. It's based on Charles Darwin, pictured here, his theory of evolution. This is a biological theory, and he explains that in his Origin of the Species here. So according to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the fittest species will survive because they pass on the best traits, the traits that help them to survive. They pass those traits on to their offspring through a process called natural selection. Okay, this is adopted as a social theory by sociologists and economists of this day, of the late 1800s, 19th century. And so ultimately the principle becomes, this social Darwinism is an idea that those who have wealth have worked hard to get that wealth, and they are the fittest in society, and so they should not be punished because of their wealth. So it also supports an idea that people who are poor because they're lazy and they haven't worked hard to gain wealth. The ideas of social Darwinism will in the age of the late 1800s will be a justification for the wealthy maintaining their wealth. Okay, it will be a justification for the oppression of the poor and keeping large laboring classes in poor working conditions and paying them low wages. And it will encourage the government to stay out of the economy. So don't regulate the economy, because those who are wealthy because they've earned it and they're the fittest to survive. Okay. So those ideas will be propagated not just through politicians and businessmen so that they can maintain their wealth, but there's also a American cultural identity change here. Many people in America look up to men like Andrew Carnegie, and they see their rags to riches story and they admire it. Here you see the novel Risen from the Ranks, written by Horatio Alger. This is many novels published during this time tell those rags to riches kind of story. And it goes back to that American principle of Puritanism, that hard work ethic. You know, if you are wealthy, then it's because God's blessed your hard work. So that's kind of a thread throughout American history and a theme of like the American dream. So growth and consolidation of business, we see that Carnegie uses both vertical and horizontal integration, and that's going to be mimicked by other industrial leaders, like pictured here in the lower right, John David Rockefeller. Rockefeller is he is the owner of Standard Oil Company, and he also becomes a titan of his industry, or arguably a robber baron in his industry, by buying out competitors. Rockefeller does this in a way that ultimately forms a monopoly on the industry. Okay, so what is a monopoly? A monopoly is when you take out all of the competition and you own most of the manufacturing within your industry. So how does Rockefeller reach this ultimate end? Well, he does this by what we call mergers. Okay, so he'll buy out a competing company and absorb that company within his own Standard Oil company. He will also create trust, which is a trust is a holding company. The whole purpose of a trust, it exists just to buy shares in companies. And once it buys enough shares to control the company, then you have a complete monopoly of an industry through a trust. Now, this whole idea of social Darwinism argues that the fittest survive, but many of these industrial titans employ ruthless tactics like Rockefeller. Rockefeller takes out many of his competitors by lowering the price of his oil product so low that temporarily he's not earning a profit. So bottoming out his price so that the competitors cannot compete, because at selling oil at that particular price, he's not making a profit until he drives competitors out of the market. Those vicious tactics are unregulated. There are no regulations on corporations at this time, and competing companies begin to foment and work together, advocating that the government step in and help them against these ruthless tactics like Rockefeller and other robber barons of industries employ. Okay, so we've talked about Rockefeller and his robber baron tactics. The term robber baron comes from critics of these industrialists. So the federal government passes, and the Congress of the United States passes the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act makes it illegal to form trust that interfere with interstate commerce. The problem is the Sherman Antitrust Act, the language of the legislation doesn't define very well what a trust is. And so companies like Standard Oil, if the Department of Justice starts to investigate them and they sue them in violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, they can just break Standard Oil Company up into smaller companies, and all of a sudden they're no longer accountable for their actions. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is very difficult to use against trust. And after the Department of Justice several times, they file suit against companies, and the Supreme Court rules against the Department of Justice, they just stop trying to break up these trusts. So it takes some time. It won't be until really the 20th century that the federal government really gets some traction and power against large trust. All right, so let's talk about this business boom and the South. How does the South fare? There are several different things to understand about why this industrial business boom kind of bypasses the South. In the post-Civil War era, the South is destroyed. The Civil War was fought primarily on Southern soil. William Sherman's march through the South had devastated, burning major cities, and then many wealthy citizens of the South had taken their capital, and they'd use that to buy or to invest in Confederate currency. Okay, Confederate currency is now worthless. So the many people who had money before the Civil War in the South no longer have money. Okay, so they don't really have the capital to invest in industry. And then the one big business in the South is the rail industry, and the rail industry even Southern rail lines are primarily owned by Northern businesses. So, in large part, the industrial growth that we see in the era after the Civil War, it bypasses the South. There are a few industries, though, that we do see boom. The timber industry booms in the South after the Civil War. We also see some steel in places like Richmond and Birmingham. We see a little bit of shipbuilding in the South, but for the most part, the South remains agricultural in the years after the American Civil War during this age of industry.